Thank you, everybody, for joining this special session. And it's not a session I'm particularly thrilled to be hosting, in all honesty. I'd much rather be talking about other things, and I'm sure you'd rather be hearing about other things as well. But I just wanted to begin by saying that I'm glad folks are here. I'm glad there's so many of you who are inclined to listen about this. And once again, as I've mentioned in a couple of my other sessions, that veer a little bit more into current politics than I would typically do, essentially out of necessity in this moment. I do appreciate the fact that a fair number of you listening are listening, as I've said before, despite what I'm saying, not because of it. And I'm glad, especially, that you're here if you're not necessarily inclined to listen to folks talk about politics. That's not this channel. That's not my goal here. But in this moment, to talk about weather, to talk about climate and climate change and wildfire, and the Earth system in general, in the United States, this really is a critical issue. And to some other folks who have reflected that I'm not talking about other political things right now, that is a strategic decision for a couple of reasons. It's not that I don't care about other things. It's certainly not to say that weather and climate, whether it's weather prediction or funding for climate science or for science even in general, is the only issue that's important in this moment. Far from it. In fact, I'm personally very concerned about a lot of the things that are unfolding even in the news today as we speak. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I highly encourage folks to check out how today's international meeting at the White House went. But that's not really the focus of this channel. And what I'm trying to do is to talk about a fairly narrow range of topics on which I can speak clearly and I think reasonably authoritatively, because these are the sorts of things that I have deep personal and professional knowledge in, and I do think I'm qualified to opine on the consequences and the potential impacts of what has transpired so far and what is likely coming, or what could be coming down the pike. So this is to acknowledge that I think and I don't really know any of my colleagues in science, though they are rightfully concerned about weather and climate and science in general in the US. I know my colleagues in biomedical science and any number of other fields are equally, if not even more concerned at this moment, given what has already happened. We all acknowledge this is not the only thing that matters, and this is not really a conversation we're trying to have right now out of self-interest, although of course it does affect, since we are weather and climate scientists, it does affect our lives and livelihoods to a significant degree. But it's because I think this is something that we can talk about in a contextually meaningful way without hyperbole or extrapolation. And I think that is my goal in having this conversation here today. So I just wanted to offer that preface for why I'm continuing to have these occasional sessions where I do a little bit deeper of a dive into the real politic of what's going on right now all around us. It is worth noting that in previous years, this is not really something I did. I've always been involved in the policy world. I would consider myself, as a human being and as an American citizen, a politically engaged individual. But I don't use these platforms really to talk about that side of my life. And that's not what I'm going to do today either. But I do think it's important to realize that a lot of the folks who are having these conversations are having them not because we particularly feel like we're qualified to talk about politics per se, or that we particularly want to in public settings, because the situation right now is so extraordinary that I don't really think that there's a realistic alternative option in this moment. So with that, I did want to offer one piece of housekeeping information now that my audio issues have apparently been worked out. And that is that, since some folks have been asking, there is a new way to support the Weather West channel if you are so inclined, and if you are able, in the form of a monthly membership. The link to do so is at the top of the live chat right now. You can also find it on the homepage of the Weather West profile on YouTube. But the basic idea is that I'm not putting any of the core content behind any kind of paywall whatsoever. Those who have followed me for years will know that's kind of the way I do things. But in this case, this is yet another option where that has become available, and there are some modest perks if you do so. You will get some YouTube sticker acknowledgement, and I have created, I spent some time this weekend creating the initial batch, some custom weather-themed emojis that you'll have access to if you sign up for that membership. So nothing mission critical. You'll be able to see all the live streams whether or not you're a member. Nothing substantial will be behind a paywall, but you will have access to some weather emojis. And also I will be posting occasional weather and cloud photos that I've taken myself over the years in that membership section. But that's about it. Otherwise, again, all of the primary content will stay right in front of that. Since I don't really think this is the moment to be restricting access to information for a variety of reasons that are relevant to the conversation we are having today, I think. Okay, deep breath. What I really want to talk about today, well, first of all, is to update the litany of changes and cuts and firings and proposals and craziness that's going on at the federal level when it comes to weather, climate, wildfire, science, and practice. And by practice there, I mean not just the study of these things in an abstract or academic or scientific sense, but also the practical implementation of the applied science of weather and climate and wildfire. So that extends to weather prediction and extreme weather warnings and disaster response and preparedness and wildfire response and preparedness. So I'm going to be talking about how changes we've seen recently are affecting all of these things, and how what we've seen so far is really just the tip of the iceberg, and how one of my great concerns right now in this moment is that already we're seeing great disruption, and this appears to be, by all indications, just the beginning of far greater upheaval to come, and perhaps sooner rather than later, given some of the dates popping up in these documents and I'm going to be sharing today are in April and May. So we're talking a matter of days to weeks when some of these things could become imminently even more relevant than they have been. And I did compile I'm going to read verbatim from some of these documents because I think it's important to be accurate to the source material in this, I guess you could call it pseudo-journalism role, although I'm not a journalist, so that's dangerous territory. But in any case, I really want folks to understand the kind of language that's being used by the federal government, by the agencies making these changes or proposing these changes, or the entities proposing these changes anyway. And I think the reason why that matters is that the articulated goals and aims and rationale are part of why I'm so concerned about what's next. Because this is very different than in previous years, previous administrations, when there have been similarly large cuts to science or climate science, or even essentially censorship, or in some cases literally censorship of federal government scientists. It's never good when that happens, but I think what we're seeing now is at least an order of magnitude, if not multiple orders of magnitude, more extreme than what we've seen, from what I can tell, at any previous point in modern American history. Certainly in the era in which we've had a major weather, climate, and wildfire enterprise in this country. We've not seen these sorts of actions and threats in that modern context. So what I want to do is just summarize where we are now. And for those of you who've been following, the last time I had this conversation about on the policy side of what's going on, been talking about how there were large-scale cuts to, for example, the National Weather Service component of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, so National Weather Service within NOAA, and how this was already affecting our preparedness for extreme weather events, our extreme weather response, disaster response, and that the fact that the impacts were not more apparent already to most people is not because the impact of these cuts is small, but because of the valiant efforts of the people who remain in these now critically understaffed roles in field offices to maintain as much of a semblance of normalcy and efficacy as they possibly can. But the cracks are really now starting to show. One reality was that there was a lawsuit and subsequent U.S. Supreme Court decision that temporarily forced agencies, especially NOAA, to reinstate some of the people who had been summarily fired under false pretenses back in February. Now, that, unfortunately, there was a subsequent ruling that actually allowed those firings to go ahead. So what happened to a lot of people in the federal government, including a number of people who I have personally corresponded with in NOAA, is that they were fired in February with no notice, then were reinstated to a status of administrative leave for a period of time, and now have been refired. Again, summarily, and in some cases fired retroactively back to the original effective date months ago of their firing. And so there are, of course, legal, economic, and financial implications for these people on an individual level, but also just the real insult to injury of being fired from the same job more than once for no particular reason. And so that is what's going on here, is that there were a lot of headlines on how all these people have been reinstated, but it turns out that most of them actually were not really reinstated. They were temporarily brought back on administrative leave, and then now they are truly gone and fired, and the Supreme Court said that's okay. So that's one piece of important context. At the National Weather Service, there are now a number of places that are critically understaffed, and I've been speaking with a lot of journalists in recent days. What they're finding is it has become exceptionally difficult to get people to go on the record who are currently still employed by the federal government, including some people who've been let go for all of the tumultuous reasons that we've been talking about, but especially people who are still employed by the Weather Service or NOAA or other agencies, because there has been cultivated an extreme culture of fear for understandable reasons, given the threatening and demeaning communications that are coming from the federal government, the Office of Personnel Management, and agency heads almost every day via email and internal communications, many of which have been leaked. I'm not speculating. The language of these is publicly available. But it's become really difficult for journalists to get direct access to what's going on. But what I've heard, I've pieced together some anecdotes from the Weather Service, some of which are close to home, some of which are a little bit farther from home. The most recent one is the National Weather Service in Sacramento publicly noted that they're no longer going to be offering social media updates under most circumstances. This has come to be a pretty important function of some of the local field offices with the Weather Service. Their updates on Twitter or X or Facebook or other entities, including during extreme weather events and disasters. Because that's, it's meeting people where they are. Essentially, it is communicating to people using the means and the mechanisms that they're using to interact with the world, which is a very important part of science and disaster and public communication. In any number of contexts, that's why we're having this conversation, for example, on YouTube. But the other piece here is that behind the scenes, what's going on is that the Weather Service in Sacramento is now critically understaffed, and it turns out that the primary reason why they're not offering this is not because they've necessarily been instructed to stand down, for example, but the real reason is arguably worse. They do not have the person power anymore to do their critical forecasting duties and offer those updates to the public using all of these media. That's concerning because this was a pretty important function, and they managed to find a way to do it in the past, even under significant time and personnel pressure. So the fact that this is just a bridge too far now is a real indication of person-hour triage, of critical understaffing. And we've, of course, heard that in other circles. We know that the Weather Service office for the San Francisco Bay Area, based out of Monterey these days, has lost people, that has greatly increased the workload for other people. We've heard this for other offices either within or serving California. But there's other stories emerging from other regions. For example, a number of locations in the central U.S., immediately upwind of Tornado Alley, no longer have the ability to launch radiosondes. Each radioson launch, this is a weather balloon lofted package of instrumentation, critical for getting a vertical profile of the atmosphere, so understanding all of the atmospheric variables in real time as you go up. These are very important for initializing weather predictive models in the initial hours, and there is no immediate replacement in some areas for them. Due to critical understaffing, there's a number of offices since February that have stopped launching radiosondes because each radiosonde takes about 2 person-hours to prepare and launch, and they're supposed to be launched twice a day. So essentially what it's telling us is that even for a really critically important function in the Weather Service, that 4 person-hours per office is something that cannot be spared even for a critical operation now at a number of local field offices throughout the Great Plains, some of the Rocky Mountain region, in Alaska, and then up in Maine. So particularly at the smaller offices in rural areas, which are arguably where some of these data points are most important because we have the fewest alternative modes of getting that information. This is going to degrade weather forecasts to some extent, and the effects may not be obvious until there is a major tornado outbreak or a hurricane landfall downwind that doesn't go so well. Another pretty dramatic example, even farther to the east, is the Weather Service office, I believe it was in Paducah, Kentucky. A couple of weeks ago, a report out that the Weather Service there, the physical building, because every single purchase above $1,000, I believe, now needs to be personally approved by the Secretary of Commerce. Of course, you can imagine how many purchases on that order, every purchase above $100,000, but also purchases under that level cannot be paid for without seeking higher authorization. They can't be put on a government credit card or purchase order without going up through higher level authorization. The problem is that the toilet's backed up at the office and they're not allowed to hire a plumber. And they fired all the building maintenance people back in February, so there's no internal employees who can do it. They can't contract out because they're not allowed to authorize the contract. And so there are no functional toilets, or at least there were not for weeks at last check. Not the National Weather Service building in Paducah, Kentucky. A region that ended up being hit by a severe tornado outbreak and major flood event at the same moment, to the point where there were a number of forecasters in the office who had no alternative to use the bathroom other than a porta potty in the parking lot during an active tornado outbreak. I just want to let that image sink in a little bit. I don't think this is probably all that unrepresentative of what's going on elsewhere. It's just that it's very difficult to get people to speak because, quite frankly, everybody is fearful for their jobs, and there's every reason to believe that there are people being singled out who are speaking with the media, people who are singled out for leaking information about what's really going on. I'm hearing this all the time. Okay, so that's catching us up to a couple of weeks ago. Now I'm going to bring up some more recent information. By the way, there are other federal labs that are having to shut down operations. Scientists have already taken up things like janitorial services. They're cleaning their own bathrooms when they're still working. They're taking out the garbage. That in itself is a frustrating use of time. Not that those activities are not critically important, but of course we had fired all the people whose job it was to do that professionally, the janitors, the maintenance workers from these facilities. But more importantly, in certain labs and even in certain operational settings, there are a certain number of hazardous materials that are contained on premise in these labs that are used day by day. And there are specialized teams of people with specific qualifications, as you might expect, who are expected to handle that hazardous waste resulting from science and operations. And up to a certain point, it can be stored on site, it can accumulate, but it's getting to the point where some labs are now having to shut down their operations because we fired everybody with the legal authorization to handle hazardous materials. And so we're left at the point where you're either going to force people who have no training in handling hazardous materials to somehow dispose of them, which would likely be, by the way, a federal crime for people without that legal qualification to handle those hazardous materials or dispose of them. And so in most cases, they're not being disposed of. They're accumulating up to the maximum allowable level, and these facilities are just having to shut down these labs because there's nobody to take the hazardous materials away. Anybody can empty the waste bin into the dumpster, right? But not everybody has the ability to take those chemicals out from under the fume hood and properly dispose of them in a safe and environmentally acceptable way. Okay, so there's that too. And again, that's just getting us to where we were recently. There are some people, by the way, who I've heard from who were fired now 3 different times since February, and of course, the net effect is that nobody feels particularly secure, even if they remain in their jobs. And that is not surprising because down the pike, there is now, again, credibly rumored, and by the way, I use the term credibly rumored because it's impossible to get official communications right now, but everything else that's been credibly rumored in the space so far this year has already come to pass. That I've talked about previously, so I don't necessarily have any qualms about referring to it this way. There are credibly rumored to be another massive set of layoffs coming to NOAA and other agencies, but specifically to NOAA I can talk about, on the order of 20 to 25% additional. So what we've seen so far is about a 15% attenuation of the workforce at NOAA overall, including people at the National Weather Service and the research labs. What is expected to come next is an additional 20+% reduction. Again, so this would be an even larger increment than the previous one, resulting in net 40+% attenuation of the total workforce. And that is before what I'm about to talk about, in addition to that, might go into effect. So that's where we are now. We don't know what's going to happen with what's known as a reduction in force or an RIF, but it's essentially extending now well beyond the probationary employees potentially who were fired originally in February, then again in March, and then in some cases a third time this week. Last week, a couple of additional developments. I believe it was Tuesday that the U.S. Global Change Research Program, the entity that is responsible for compiling the National Climate Assessment, which is a congressionally mandated report on the observed and expected impacts of climate change in the United States. The executive branch has terminated the contract with the company that administered that. That involved about 20 people who were actually administering the program. By the way, nearly all of the work on the science and writing side, so on the non-administrative support side, was essentially volunteer work by scientists around the country, including many of my colleagues. The most of the federal government expenditure on behalf of them over the years was generally things like a $1,000 travel reimbursement when people had to fly to DC for a couple of days for a meeting. That's pretty much the extent of it. People did not draw a salary. They were not paid stipends generally. It was essentially a volunteer work on their part. But the problem is, because of that, you did need professionals to actually physically put the report together and administer all the coordination that was required into producing a congressionally mandated report, which then becomes a formal government document. Well, it now appears that report likely will not move forward, even though it is still congressionally mandated, because there's no one left to administer it. And it really can't be done fully on a volunteer basis because everybody who is volunteering has full-time jobs doing other things as scientists and professors all around the country. So it is quite plausible at this point that there will not be a congressionally mandated, there will not be an update to the National Climate Assessment when it was required to be released, either in 2027 or 2028 as a result of this. So that's an active thing that's still sort of unfolding, but right now, unfortunately, it appears that's likely to be the case. Will there be an independently released alternative to the federal report? That's a possibility, but it's going to be difficult to stand that up, I think. And it certainly won't have the influence that a formal, again, congressionally mandated document would have. Also, last week, the Department of Commerce, specifically NOAA, ended a long-standing cooperative agreement with Princeton University and what's known as the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, or GFDL, which is a cooperative agreement between the federal government and Princeton to operate a weather and climate modeling research lab that is famous the world over. And it has been essentially the test bed for most weather prediction models and in many cases some of the latest climate predictive models that are out there. Some of the most significant advances in weather and climate prediction in recent years have come out of this space, and the cooperative agreement between the federal government and Princeton University that made it possible has been, to my understanding, largely terminated, if not completely so. It's unclear whether it terminated the entirety of the agreement, but that is certainly how it reads. Again, there's uncertainty because it does not appear that the folks doing the terminating actually understand the full scope of what that agreement actually entailed. But I think it's really important. This is where I want to read some of that document verbatim, and I'm just checking in briefly on the comments to make sure they're still going smoothly. It looks like they're all right now. So I want to read verbatim from the document published. Again, this is a verbatim excerpt from the Department of Commerce explaining why they terminated this agreement with Princeton University. And I'm reading it not so much because this is the most singularly important thing of all, but because I think the language here is very telling. It kind of gives away the game, the broader game, if you will. And I think it's important to understand, it's important context for understanding what I think is coming next at a much broader sense than just this one agreement. So I'm just going to read this aloud. And this is a verbatim quote until I note otherwise. So the quote reads, "This cooperative agreement promotes exaggerated and implausible climate threats, contributing to a phenomenon known as, quote, climate anxiety, which has increased significantly among America's youth. Its focus on alarming climate scenarios fosters fear rather than rational, balanced discussion. And additionally, the use of federal funds to support these narratives is misaligned with the administration's priorities." End quote. So this is essentially one of the most dramatic examples of gaslighting that I've seen in a long time. It's saying essentially that the reason why they're canceling the climate modeling agreement between the federal government and the world's premier geophysical fluid dynamics laboratory is because the kids are afraid of climate change that is made up. Obviously, that's just a gross mischaracterization of the factual reality of the world that we live in. But I think the most insulting part of it is probably the notion that the people who are anxious about climate change are anxious about something that isn't real, or that their fear isn't justified, or that the underlying threat isn't there. That's just factually inaccurate. So instead of saying we can make people less afraid about climate change by dealing with the problem, literally saying think of the children, and to think of the children, we should just pretend that it's not a problem at all and let's not talk about it. More importantly, essentially, that Earth system modeling in general is misaligned with the administration's priorities. Okay, another quote, and again, this is verbatim once again. Quote, "This cooperative agreement suggests that the Earth will have a significant fluctuation in its water availability as a result of global warming. Using federal funds to perpetuate these narratives does not align with the priorities of this administration." End quote. So essentially now saying that the ability to foresee, understand, and predict variations in water availability in the United States for American interests is not in the interest of the administration. And to perpetuate false narratives that climate change is influencing the water cycle is somehow wrong. And of course, we know, again, this is just factually inaccurate, but it is extraordinary to have it written in such plain terms. And again, this is why I really wanted to read some of this verbatim, because I think it's important to understand the language that's being used to justify much of what we're talking about. So what this document really tells us is it's a little bit of an updated blueprint. I've talked before and I've read verbatim, if you're interested, from the sections in the Project 2025 document that so many people insisted would not become a policy blueprint for the current administration, but by all accounts is really just an absolute checklist for what has happened thus far in so many realms. In fact, there's even a website you can go to right now which shows you in the form of a checklist which of the Project 2025 specific objectives have been achieved. Many of them have or are on the way to being achieved. But I think this particular document, even though it's just a page referring to what's going on at Princeton, tells us a lot about how the things we're about to talk about and we're about to experience will be justified. So this brings me now to the breaking news from late last week. I think this was a Friday news dump last week. What's known as a passback document from the White House, the executive branch. That in itself is not unusual. Those documents are leaked in every administration, and they often make news for having, proposing bold cuts or huge changes to the federal budget that people don't like for whatever reason. That part itself is not so unusual. But what is extraordinary in this document is the level of the proposed draconian, really existential cuts for, among other things, weather and climate science in the United States and operational application of weather and climate science in the United States. And the other thing that's different, I think, this time around is that often, these make newsy headlines around this time when the passback document, which is essentially a proposed budget, is that there's this notion that, well, Congress has to approve whatever the budget is ultimately, and usually it's quite different from whatever is proposed by the White House, and whatever the huge cuts often get attenuated. But there's two reasons why I think we cannot make that assumption. In fact, why I think that's probably an erroneous assumption this time around. The first is that in general, many large-scale cuts have already been made through Elon Musk's Doge project, which has been operating under mysterious auspices and under authority that it remains constitutionally unclear. At best. But in any case, many of the changes we've already seen at NOAA, at NASA, and the Weather Service, and in the National Institutes for Health, and so many other entities, federal entities, have occurred without any input from Congress whatsoever. And even though the congressional appropriations for the budgets for these entities has not changed yet, because we haven't had that conversation yet in Congress, people have been fired anyway, institutes have been closed anyway, research projects have been ended, contracts and grants have been canceled regardless. So there's already a clear precedent and mechanism in recent weeks and months for these kinds of changes to be implemented long before Congress has any say, before the legislative branch gets to exert any kind of moderating influence. And secondly, and this was something that came up in a conversation with some journalists this morning who've received copies of this leaked document and were able to confirm this for me, is that in the document itself, this passback document, it is requested that agency and department heads in the federal government prepare a plan for implementation immediately, long before the budget for 2026 is reviewed and approved by Congress. In fact, there is supposedly a clause in this passback document that demands that administrators, high-level agency heads and administrators, provide a written plan for implementation by April 24th. I'm looking at the calendar. That's in 10 days. Congress is not looking or reviewing at this budget anywhere near that timeline. So my concern is that this is essentially going to be used as an excuse for Elon Musk's Doge or whatever mechanism is next to sort of implement the kinds of things that I'm about to talk about almost immediately. This is something that there was some initial skepticism this is going to have to pass through Congress first. I'm not convinced at all that's actually the case. Even if it were the case, there's a question of how much pushback there would be from Congress in the present environment. I won't speculate on that, but I will say that there's a clause that is essentially trying to get agencies and departments to comply with this within weeks, or really within days. Okay, so what is actually in this proposal? Well, the most prominent thing is to close entirely the NOAA Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, or OAR. This is the branch of NOAA that funds research of all kinds: weather, climate, oceans, disasters, wildfires, you name it. It provides internal funding within NOAA for NOAA scientists in some cases, but it's more famous for providing external funding. So to scientists employed by universities, for example, to professors. I have applied, although never received, a NOAA grant to do research in the past. They are highly competitive, much as grants from the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, NIH, or DOE, the Department of Energy. They're all competitive grants that primarily university or institutional scientists can apply for to essentially cover the costs of doing the research in whatever field they're in. In this case, NOAA obviously is funding ocean, atmosphere, climate, weather, fire research, as you would expect an agency with the words ocean and atmosphere in its name to be funding. Entirely appropriate. This passback document, this proposed budget, calls for completely eliminating that office within NOAA. Not quite zeroing out its budget, giving it a sort of a small residual budget, but then shunting it into other parts of NOAA and completely eliminating the office as a separate entity, and essentially ending all climate research funded by NOAA, either internally or externally. Full stop. 100%. Also, it says that it would, the document claims to largely preserve weather research, but that is clearly not the case when you actually look at what is proposed. In fact, there would be massive cuts to weather research as well, partly because a lot of what is characterized as, quote, climate change research is actually, in practice, extreme weather research, because increasingly extreme weather is strongly affected by climate change. But in any case, this would be really a decapitation strike against climate research within NOAA. Simultaneously, NASA, in the same passback document, is actually targeted for even larger proportional cuts. We're talking like 50% cut to the entire organization of NASA, and almost just a scorched earth policy when it comes to planetary science research. The Earth is a planet, and so Earth science, and therefore weather and climate research sponsored by NASA, is then included in what is almost completely zeroed out in this budget. So again, no more climate research from NOAA. No more climate research from NASA. Full stop in this budget. In addition, many of the cooperative research centers, if not most of them, run by NOAA would be completely closed. Additionally, entire NASA facilities, including some that employ as many as 10 to 15,000 people each, would be completely shuttered. That includes NASA Goddard in Maryland, for example. The short version is, in its own summary of this document, is that it, quote, cuts all funding for climate, weather, and ocean laboratories and cooperative institutes in the United States. On top of that, it also cancels the agreement between NOAA and NASA, again, two federal agencies. They're not competitors. They're using the same pool of federal tax dollars and congressionally appropriated funding. Ends the long-standing partnership where NOAA can procure a satellite from NASA. So NASA, being the space agency, takes care of all the technical details of, rocket science, literally in this case. Meteorologists are not necessarily rocket scientists, even though the Newtonian physics work the same. But this has been how NOAA gets access to its own satellites, and this partnership would end. It would decimate any future geostationary satellite updates. In fact, it would even remove instrumentation from some upgraded satellites that's already been partially paid for subsequent satellite launches, including things like lightning detection, including things like carbon carbon dioxide and methane monitoring, because they're viewed as being too climate change related, so they're just zeroing it out. I think the important thing to understand here is that I don't think we should view these as things that are hypothetical cuts, or that things that probably won't happen, or things that will likely get attenuated by Congress or in the final budget for whatever reason because the administration changes its mind. I think we need to take all of this, as I've been saying for a long time, at literal face value and assume that this is actually something that, unless something is done to dramatically shift public opinion, and public opinion therefore shift the political tides at the moment, to really be opposed to this, that it's probably going to happen. And if it did, it really would spell the end of most publicly funded climate research in the United States. There is other climate research through other federal agencies, like National Science Foundation, for example, Department of Energy, to a certain extent, the USDA and other institutions as well. However, some of these have already been quite decimated, particularly the climate programs, as I've already been talking about this year. And frankly, given the language used here, I think we're going to see very similar cuts and proposals, and probably attempted implementation, at least, at all these other entities that also sponsor climate research. The fact that the NSF and DOE haven't seen the same level of cuts, I do not find that all reassuring. I just think that they haven't gotten to it yet. If you view Project 2025 as a literal, temporally expanding contiguous checklist, it's next. So we'll see what happens there. But I want to just once again offer a quote from that document, from the Passback document itself, because I think, again, it's really important to understand that the language that the federal government is using to articulate why it's trying to pursue these goals. And this is a very short quote, just one sentence, or even a fragment of a sentence, but it's a particularly eyebrow-raising one. And here it is. Essentially, the stated reason for zeroing out climate research, for getting rid of all these research institutes, for ending really all federal support for anything that's even remotely climate or climate change or extreme weather related, is the following: the need to, or the desire to, be seen as, quote, eliminating the federal government's support of woke ideology, end quote. That is the stated reason. So that's not me making it up. That's not me embellishing or inferring anything. That's a verbatim quote from the document that proposes these existentially huge cuts. And I don't relish that in any way. But that is what is going on. That's the kind of language that federal government employees are getting in their inbox every day to describe why they're lazy, low productivity, why they've been brainwashed by the woke mob. I mean, these are not terms that I'm using as a human being, as an American citizen. These are terms that the federal government is using to describe its own civil servants and the policies of previous administrations. So I think this leads to a major question: is how much pushback is there going to be against this? Will our elected representatives understand just how catastrophic this kind of rhetoric and these potential actions would be? I mean, we've already seen major consequences from the decimation thus far that appears to be, by all indications, rapidly accelerating. I hope so. There's certainly been some very strong words, but it's not clear to me that will be enough without a lot more understanding by the wider public of just how monumentally catastrophic this would be if it actually comes to pass. And I don't think it's a distant hypothetical, but I think it's right now, it's probably the most likely outcome unless the trajectory changes. And so this is the moment for that trajectory to change. And what that means partly is getting the word out. It partly means even making your elected representatives aware of just exactly what's in this. Again, I've read a lot of things verbatim from the documents that are coming from the federal government today. I don't think anything I'm saying is particularly outlandishly speculative. And so we're in really this critical moment where, as I mentioned, in the beginning of this conversation, this is not the only thing that matters. Weather and climate research, weather and climate operations, even, as much as I think we all, and everybody who's on this call agrees to some extent is critically important, it certainly isn't the only thing that's important. And there are other critically important things going on right now that I'm quite alarmed by, as a human being and as an American citizen. But this is one very concrete area where I think there's a lot of value in articulating as widely as possible, including to your own elected representatives, particularly your national congressional representatives, because that is where this is eventually going to end up specifically. Just how critical these services are, just how catastrophic it would be if we don't have these things, if we don't have any more climate research in the U.S., if we don't have the National Climate Assessment, if we don't have fully staffed or even minimally staffed, in some cases, National Weather Service offices during wildfire events or atmospheric river events or tornado outbreaks or hurricane outbreaks, wherever you happen to be in the country. But also, I think it's important to understand that none of this appears to be, by any rational accounting, in the name of efficiency or reducing expenditures. It seems to be deeply ideologically rooted, and I wish that weren't the case. And the great irony is that I think folks like me and a lot of other people would have had pretty strong, could have been pretty strong allies for folks trying to increase efficiency and reduce waste, real inefficiency and real waste in any number of sectors. Bureaucracy irritates the hell out of me. I have to deal with so much in this line of work, believe me. I'm no fan of red tape for the sake of red tape. But that's not what's happening here by any stretch of the imagination. And I really think it's important to understand that the net result is going to be massive economic harm, massive expenditures eventually by the federal government that it otherwise wouldn't have had to make, because a lot of what's going to happen is that as we break these things, eventually it will become painfully and unignorably obvious what we've broken and how important it was, and it's going to be unbelievably expensive in the scramble to try and get it back. And we might not be able to get it back, but we'll probably try, and it will be incredibly expensive to try and spin these things back up once we move fast and break them. So I think that's what I've got for today, and I do have a few minutes where I want to take a look at some of the comments that are coming in. Again, I appreciate the engaged audience today. Okay, thanks for the words of support, folks, and I do apologize for that initial audio glitch at the beginning. That sometimes, even though I prep these things a while in advance, even best laid plans. All right. All right, here. Well, if you have not asked a question related to today's discussion yet and would like to, please leave one right now in the chat, and I will have some time potentially to answer it because there's more comments than questions today. Understandable, given the subject matter at hand. There's a comment that we need to consider charities or sort of private philanthropy, maybe is the broader term, filling in vacated funding gaps. I am actively working now, actually, with a number of private philanthropic institutions to try and scale up their efforts. But I just want to point out the fact that the scale of operations of the federal government is so much larger than the scale of most philanthropic organizations. And there are also other reasons why you can't rely on charities to provide basic public services. So certainly we shouldn't be doing that in the wealthiest nation on earth. It's, for one thing, fiscally highly inefficient to try and find private fundings for things like basic infrastructure and life-saving weather services, for example, partly because we're able to enjoy historically the efficiencies of having this all centralized and coordinated by the federal government over time. And the other challenge when it comes to research, for example, is when private sector sponsors research. This is not universally true, and I say this as somebody who does have my own private philanthropic funding to do what I do today, and I've also received private grants to do sponsored research in the weather and climate world. So this is not to certainly to malign anybody who does this, especially in this current moment, because I do think there's going to be an expanded need for private philanthropy. But the challenge is if all science is done through charities and sponsored by corporations, you have a much stronger problem with conflict of interest, to be quite honest, where if a given entity with a particular vested interest in a particular outcome to the scientific question you're addressing is the one sponsoring the research, I would hope that most scientists would have the ethical and moral fortitude to not let that affect their results. But even in many cases, and the research will show this, even in many cases, if scientists try hard and believe that they're unbiased in their research in that capacity, often those biases are still there. Often you still do get skewed outcomes. And this has been historically demonstrated most often in the biomedical world, because that's really the world primarily where companies sponsor private entities, profit-driven entities, corporations sponsor research, because as you can imagine, things like drug discovery, you need to prove that a drug works for a particular condition, and who might want to have that knowledge? It might be the drug company that developed it and would then sell a successful drug if it's proven that it's safe and effective for a particular condition, for example. It's a little bit less obvious what that would look like in the weather and climate world, but there's a long history of the oil industry, for example, sponsoring research that essentially favors fossil fuels instead of renewable energy, or downplays the negative effects of oil spills, for example. So there's a reason why that happens, and it's because there is an inherent vested interest to having private entities sponsoring research. There's a little bit less of that problem with private philanthropy, at least ostensibly, because there's not a profit motive involved. And so, I don't disagree that I think there is, for no other reason than out of pure necessity, going to have to be a larger role played by funding for scientific research, for basic research. There is a precedent for that. Some of the big companies in the world, in the United States, by the way, used to be much bigger sponsors of basic research that didn't have immediate or obvious commercial applications. I'm thinking about Bell Labs, for example, or General Motors. In fact, some of the early research on climate change, believe it or not, actually came out of General Motors. If anybody ever knew Ruth Reck, was one of the pioneers of that research decades ago within General Motors research labs. Bell Labs and any number of other corporate, essentially company-funded research labs produced really good work that was not highly applied in a specific context of the company even, but was actually quite broad. We don't have that anymore. We don't really have companies sponsoring those sorts of open-ended labs. I think it would actually be a good thing if large corporations brought back that kind of support for basic research. So I think that would be great. But I still think it's a bit, and I think that's even quite a bit different than industry sponsoring specific studies by scientists at a university or somewhere else. I think the conflict of interest there it's actually less acute because that such a person is employed by a company to do research for the company. Don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I'm kind of two minds. One is, yes, we're going to have to see the philanthropic institutions step up. Hopefully we'll see corporations step up too for basic research. But then that still leaves us with a gap for basic public services. Are we really going to say that a charity is going to sponsor the National Weather Service, that a private company is going to pay for the National Weather Service in the public interest? I just don't think that's realistic because, again, there are some functions that have massive public benefit, positive externalities, as you might say, if you're an economist, that don't have much profit motive embedded in them. And those are services essentially that are generally offered by governments in functional societies and functional nations around the world, because they're really important. They benefit everybody, but there isn't necessarily a good reason for companies to offer those services, because, companies, they do need to make money. That's part of their mandate. And it's not really something you can make money off of. And for charities, well, they're not necessarily trying to make money, but they still have a bottom line. It is a zero-sum game. The more money they put into one thing, they can't put into something else. And it's widely viewed that these things are functions of government. This should not be something that private individuals decide they have to take it upon themselves to pay for individually. It's just something that should be subsidized really through taxation, through tax dollars. I don't really see a way around that for these basic public services, and even for a good portion of the research that I'm talking about. Some of it, perhaps. And again, this is not to malign any entities that are trying to offer that kind of support, and I'm actively working with at least 4 different philanthropic institutions right now to broaden support for scientists and science communicators in this space. I'll talk more about that later this year, hopefully, once those plans are a little bit more ready for public consumption. But in any case, it's a challenge, but we cannot replace the entire federal research infrastructure, the entire federal predictive services for weather and climate and disaster response through charitable or private funding. It just is not going to happen, and so if we lose it, we're going to lose it. It's not coming from somewhere else. All right, here, let's see. There's a comment from Gina that I think this was in reference to me saying how a lot of journalists are not able to get people to go on the record, and this is because of the Hatch Act. They cannot speak against the current administration. The Hatch Act seems to have gone out the window a long time ago, since it's pretty clear that the federal government employees at the executive branch regularly don't seem to believe that it exists. The Hatch Act does not extend to civil servants, though, acting in their official capacity to answer questions that are in their operational capacity in their line of work. So a meteorologist answering a question about why they're not able to offer severe weather warnings on a social media website when they did before, to my understanding, and if there's any lawyers in the audience, you can correct me, but that is not actually subject to Hatch Act restrictions. But again, I understand why this is a challenge right now. I'm not a journalist, but I can't even get some of my colleagues to tell me what's going on right now, which is, I've certainly never had that happen before in any administration over the years. Yeah, there's a comment that there are major cuts to FEMA going on as well. Yes, this is, in fact, again, in Project 2025, it is stated that FEMA is not a desirable organization to keep around at all. So there may be an effort to completely dismantle FEMA, and it is worth noting that the administration also last week stated that the damage in western North Carolina didn't look too bad, despite the fact that there's still a lot of people living in tents in the mountains of western North Carolina at last check, and there's still some highways that don't exist in these river valleys, and cut off additional federal disaster relief funding to that region. A region that has now, I would remind folks, recently been hit by wildfires following the historically severe flooding. Wildfires that are being made a bit worse, actually, by all of the extensive tree damage, the dead and down branches and trees that are now on the ground and are providing fuel for these fires that are occurring amid a drought. Notably, by the way, that region was experiencing a drought before Hurricane Helene, then experienced literally the heaviest rainfall event and the worst flooding on record in the region, and then has gone right back into a drought now, experiencing significant wildfire activity. Not a great sequence of events for anybody who's living there, and certainly not a great circumstance for disaster, in which for federal disaster relief to be denied, including some relief that had already been promised and was sort of taken away. So just continuing to take a look at the comments here, we'll see what questions there might be at the end. The question from Tim, a comment first, thank you for this information. Then, is the legacy media covering these details? You know, people often say, why isn't this in the New York Times? Why isn't this in the LA Times? Why isn't this in Bloomberg? And, you know, in some of these cases, I'm surprised that there isn't more coverage. But I'll be honest with you, this is showing up in the legacy media. Just, I can tell you by virtue of the fact that I am having these conversations with journalists and these articles are getting published. So if people aren't seeing these articles, that is a bit of a different problem in some cases than it not being reported on. And it absolutely is. Do I think there should be more reporting? Yeah. But you can Google this, and you will find a lot of pretty big deal headlines from major outlets, national outlets, international outlets, and local ones covering precisely this. So it is getting out there. If people aren't aware of it, that may or may not actually be a failure of the legacy media to do the reporting, and more of a failure of sort of our closed social media ecosystem and constantly getting fed what the algorithm wants us to read. You know, recently, just as an aside, I was talking with some family members about what kinds of content that their social media algorithm feeds them, and it's almost entirely non-overlapping with what I see. Now, that's not too surprising in a certain extent. Everybody, you know, we're all different people, but the fact that there's almost no overlap at all between those, what the algorithm is serving people of similar age living in a similar place, but with different, presumably different browsing histories and different social media connections, is really striking, and I think tells us a lot about perhaps how we've gotten to this moment. Just taking a look here at the remaining comments. Obviously, usually I try and keep these to an hour, and I usually end up going a little bit over, so this will be another one of those. Yes, I mean, as folks are pointing out, Congress could stop this. They do have the power to do so, ultimately. Again, there are entities like Elon Musk's Doge project that are essentially making an end run around most of the usual processes involved in these, but there are limits to what they can do, and ultimately Congress will have to approve a new budget. So I think that really is where the rubber meets the road, and where I think some understanding of what's at stake could be really valuable in this moment. It looks like there might have been a little bit of a brief connectivity interruption there, but I'm continuing to go here, so thanks for bearing with me. Nope, looks like we're in better shape now. Good to see. Yes, there's a question about whether the climate threat assessment done by the Pentagon, well, I don't know whether it's officially been cut or not at this point, but there's already been announcements by the Department of Defense that there will not be climate change factored into decision making for the duration, the remainder of the administration, which of course is a big problem even for basic things like operational readiness. I don't know the particular status of that report, but it is a major concern moving forward for sure. And it really just, I mean, military leadership in years past have long talked about how climate change, and this is literally language from the military, is a, quote, threat multiplier, which is actually such apropos language that's been borrowed and used in other contexts, because that's exactly what it is in so many ways. That is not language I think we're going to see coming out of the current Department of Defense. I don't know the exact status of that report, though. I don't have confirmation personally. Comments that ECMWF, so the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and really that's kind of an anachronism a little bit. ECMWF now is sort of the all-in weather, climate change, environment agency for Europe, essentially. That they're all in and still standing. Well, that's true. And I think one of the practical effects of what we're seeing is a likely ceding of global weather and climate leadership to Europe and to ECMWF. So, yes, fortunately, ECMWF exists. Fortunately, ECMWF is going to make a lot of their data fully open access as of this fall. For the first time, it's been incredibly expensive to access for a lot of folks up until the present. That seems to be a constructive step, perhaps partly in response to what we're seeing right now. But it is sad to see the U.S. sort of voluntarily shoot itself in the foot right now. It's really just not what I would hope to be seeing in this moment when it comes to leadership in the weather and climate space at such an absolutely critical moment. Both because of climate change in general and the effects of it globally, but also just because this is sort of a watershed moment in even things basic like weather prediction. I mean, we've talked before about these advances in artificial intelligence and AI weather models and all of that, and I can talk a little bit more about that in a session maybe later this year more narrowly devoted to it. But that's the tricky part, is that now this is something that NOAA and the public enterprise in the U.S. is just not going to be able to effectively participate in that on the international stage, if these cuts go through, which appear plausible. Okay. I had to refresh the window, so I may have lost a few of the earlier comments. In fact, I think there were so many comments that it may have crashed the browser window that I was using for some reason. So I'm going to continue with the new ones that have come in since then, since there's a lot more at the end. So bear with me. I'll stay in line, as they say. Don't a lot of other countries depend on NASA and NOAA? Alex asks. Yes, they certainly do. I know there's major concern from countries all around the world. And by the way, was just talking about ECMWF and how Europe is at least spinning up weather and climate entity kind of in parallel. Well, even ECMWF depends on data from North America and the Arctic and the Pacific Ocean that comes from NOAA. So if NOAA stops observing the Earth in these places, then that's information that we need information from every square inch of the Earth to predict the weather everywhere else on the Earth. We need information from every square inch of the Earth to predict the future climate, to project future climate of everywhere on Earth. So the more data voids, the more gaps there are, the worse things get. And that relates to another question that I saw, I think, before I had to refresh the page, which is that, are we already seeing degraded weather forecasts? I don't know who asked it, but I did see the question. And the answer is, well, the entity that would be quantitatively demonstrating it would probably be one of the NOAA research labs, or GFDL, which have largely been defunded or closed already. So that is going to be a task left up to individual people to do it on their own time and on their own dollar. I suspect that it might be difficult at this point to detect, but the longer the degradation in things like the radiosonde network go on, the longer the disruptions to information distribution and telecommunications infrastructure and the maintenance of things like radar sites and the potential discontinuation of new satellite features goes on, the more likely it is these failures will become quantitatively and readily apparent. And also, the more likely that there is a major forecast failure during an extreme event. And I think this is something that's been touched upon by a number of severe weather meteorologists who focus on severe thunderstorms and tornadoes and giant hail and hazards like that in the central U.S. Tornado Alley in the Great Plains is where those would be most common, although certainly not the only place where they happen. One of the most important pieces of information during a potential tornado outbreak is the radiosondes launched in the hours leading up to it. And so if we stop launching them preferentially in and upstream of Tornado Alley during tornado season, which, again, checking the calendar, we are smack dab in the middle of right now in April, that is a critical piece of information that could lead to a missed forecast. Or in the lead up to a major hurricane landfall, say there's a hurricane threatening Houston or New Orleans or Miami or North Carolina or even New York City, Long Island or something later this year. One of the critical pieces of information in understanding the upwind wind environment, which tells us where the storm is going to go, is from that upper air observation from those radiosondes. And so this is a case where, the hurricane, makes landfall 50 miles in one direction or the other. That's very much within the error range that could be contributed by loss of radiosonde information, hypothetically, and it might not sound like a big deal. Okay, Category 3, Category 4 hurricane goes, 50 miles to the east, 50 miles to the west. It's the same thing in big picture, right? Not at all. Because whether or not the eye and eastern eye wall and right front quadrant of that storm, which is where the strongest winds and the greatest storm surge are by far in the northern hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere it's reversed, make landfall in a major urban area or not, can be a life-altering, it can essentially have life-altering implications for people. And for example, it can affect which city you decide to evacuate, or whether you decide to evacuate people from one location to another one in a given event. And so that can have huge economic and life safety implications for a storm that's 20, 30, 40, 50 miles off. Will we be able to pinpoint cuts to observational network as the cause? That's going to be trickier. But if our hurricane track predictions are degraded this year, if our severe weather warning success rates are degraded this year, I think that could well be a major contributing factor. But it's going to be really difficult to prove, partly because of the cuts in the first place. It's going to be difficult to obtain the data that you'd need to prove it. As a comment from Jane, have you contacted major media outlets with the information you've detailed here? I speak with major media outlets every single day, pretty much, with occasional exceptions. More often than not, a day does not pass where I have not had a conversation with a major news outlet. So just for perspective, and this is why I'm grateful for my current role within UCANR, that gives me a little more flexibility to do this, especially in the present funding environment. I don't think I'd be likely to receive any federal grants for the foreseeable future. I'll just put it that way. Is that I've since November, I think I've given around 110 media interviews, for example. And that's now pretty consistent with the pace of my interactions with the media. So I really do value those connections I have with folks. You'll see me on TV a lot. You'll see me in the newspaper a lot. And I am talking about these things with everyone who will listen. I spoke with someone from the San Francisco Chronicle about all of this today. I'm speaking with someone from Bloomberg tomorrow. Last week, multiple other outlets, and I suspect as a result of this conversation in this office hour that there will be more of those interviews to come. It's a question about naming the Congress people we should contact that are the most receptive about advocating for NOAA. Generally, the advice is it's always best to contact whoever your local representatives are, because ostensibly members of Congress, in the House and the Senate, are responsive to their constituents, and that varies depending on where you are. I know many of you are in California, but even where you are within California affects who your House of Representatives members, for example, your congressional reps would actually be. So contacting, even if you think you're preaching to the choir, sometimes you'll be surprised. And in a lot of cases, some members of Congress are not really aware of any of the significance of this. Many are more receptive than others. But I think your strongest argument is if you're a constituent for someone. You can always call other offices, email other offices, talk to people, but ultimately that's often where the most important information is, because what I hear when I speak to congressional staffers and these members of Congress is that these days their email inboxes, their voicemail boxes are usually clogged, which is good. It means that people are actively engaged, but it also means that they're largely going to ignore interactions from people who are not their constituents. So usually the advice is stick with your actual members of representative where you live, even if you think they're either not receptive or they're already so receptive there's no point. There often is still, and I think the other piece I think that may even be more important is beyond that is talking with other people, not just calling your representatives and getting involved that way, but literally. You're in a taxi or a Lyft or a coffee shop or a family dinner. The last of those might be the most contentious in some settings, but this is what I do. I have these conversations with people, on the street, in the bus, wherever the case may be, and it's not always super comfortable. But I think part of it is that a lot of people just don't know what's going on. So sometimes talking with them about it can be the most valuable thing you can do, because a lot of people respond exactly as you'd expect. Like, what the heck? That's not what I want my tax dollars going to, but I didn't realize this is what was happening. Because a lot of folks are disconnected from the news, or even people who are pretty plugged into the news are plugged in a way that, is quite contingent on what the social media algorithm is serving you. And that's not really anybody's fault individually. That's just sort of how the information ecosystem is in its fragmented capacity now. So sometimes the good old have a conversation with someone is actually really valuable. A question from Scott. What is the international climate community reaction to infrastructure destruction in the U.S., and how will the big break in data impact the science? I mean, there's almost universal shock and horror in the international community, and I was meeting with some international colleagues last week. They were in the U.S. from France, and they were just completely incredulous. almost difficult to put into words the confusion. Just why would a country do such obviously self-destructive things? It's not even that they disagree so much with what's happening. It's just, I think they did, but the general background is just confusion and shock. That any country, let alone a country that internationally has long had the reputation for being the best at weather and climate research, having the best funding, the best programs, the most advanced capacity, the most advanced modeling, the envy of the world, was just shutting itself down for no apparent benefit, even to itself. That is the main reaction, and there is genuine concern that it will cascade because so much of the global weather and climate science community does depend historically on data and programs from the US. There is a rapid pivot to try and essentially find alternatives and realize that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. I mean, that's true in biomedical sciences, it's true with NATO, it's true with so many things right now. But the problem is that can't happen instantly. And so things are breaking so quickly right now. They are outpacing the ability of people to find stopgaps, including people in other countries who are trying to do this work. So will other countries be able to take the lead to follow up from Scott? I mean, I hope so, but not instantaneously, and probably not to the same degree that the US did. It's always more difficult to build things from scratch, especially if the people who are good at something historically aren't participating in that process of shifting or rebuilding it. So yes, I do think that there will be, Europe is scaling up ECMWF. I may go over there to the UK in September or October and have a longer conversation with the folks there, but I think that ultimately it is a moment of genuine concern well beyond the U.S., partly because the U.S. had been historically and until very recently a global leader in this, but also because of concern about what this means for climate change. I think a lot of climate scientists, both in the U.S. and internationally, have adjusted our priors again, personally and professionally, expecting a higher level of ultimately of global warming than we did just a year ago. Politics does really have real impacts on the trajectory of the climate system at this point. So, for example, I think that's one real world consequence is I'm changing my mental model for which climate scenarios are plausible for the future. For example, the last 3 or 4 months have made me shift upward, essentially, one IPCC trajectory in the wrong direction. That's my personal prior, for example, as to how much the world has changed in the last few months. As Lisa mentions, and as I have alluded to several times, there are so many critical things happening right now. It's a critical moment. There are many critical moments in so many different realms unfolding at this moment. And again, I don't particularly relish having these conversations like we're having today, but I think I would be negligent if I didn't have them. That's the reality. And I'm sort of forced into a position, we're all forced into a position where we have to engage with this whether we want to or not, because it's here and it's real and it's happening right now in front of us. Rebecca sort of echoing, or probably she said it first, but that if you are going to reach out to members of Congress, it is generally best to contact your own representatives wherever you live. As a question about whether the status of existing and completed research and reporting are results being retained or deleted, well, again, this is difficult to ascertain from the outside. Most public data sets that I can tell are still available, so that's something that's, it could be worse at the moment. But again, I would not read too much into that yet because I think it is a matter of time. And many of the cuts at NOAA, the National Centers for Environmental Information, for example, NCEI, which is a major data repository for NOAA, located in Nashville, North Carolina, very hard hit by Helene and the flooding, by the way, that just came back fully online in the past couple of months. would see massive cuts, and probably this is when we would start to see some data sets going offline. There could be other data sets that go offline. There's also one other piece of this. I know scientists who were fired from GFDL and NOAA in recent days who were working on cutting edge weather and climate science, and they were like 98% done with the research, getting ready to publish it. The code was there. And at 5 p.m. one day, their computer access shut off and all their files got deleted. So all of that is completely lost, all of the years of work, because it's considered in many cases, if you're a federal employee, it's illegal to maintain off-site personal copies of work that is done for the federal government that is considered federal information and documents. So there were, by legal necessity, no backups outside of the organization, and the organization deleted them. And there is essentially no recourse, because even though in some cases these papers that were in final stages of publication will have to be retracted, because the data and the code that lead up to them, if there were ever any questions about the data or if there were ever any need to replicate, cannot be replicated because the code was also deleted. So there are definitely things being lost. I'm not sure it's so much extant data repositories that have gone dark, at least so far, that I'm aware of. But there's definitely are things being deleted. References to climate change across much of the web in different agencies is being deleted. And I am concerned that extant data sets, particularly real-time updated ones, will no longer be available, especially if this next round of NOAA reduction in force or this enormous further cut through the passback that was proposed in the passback document actually comes to fruition. I just want to point out to folks, and several folks are asking again about who to contact and their representatives. There are a lot of representatives in Congress in California who would be very helpful. And California, as people sometimes forget, is a very politically diverse place, ideologically diverse place. There are very red parts of California, very blue parts of California. And some people's views may be out of alignment with who your representative is. Those may in fact be some of the very most important people to reach out to. So it's not the case that California is just preaching to the choir. Even if that were true, it would still be important to have these conversations, but I actually don't think it's true. And that's another really valuable, I think, place to engage. Apologies, a lot of these questions that I had to refresh earlier are showing up in my feed now, so I'm not going necessarily fully in order. Don't know what was going on with my browser's not played nicely today. And by the way, when folks say that their local representatives aren't receptive, one of the reasons why it's important to call is that sometimes what happens is offices will literally be counting the number of calls about a particular issue, or to a lesser extent the number of emails, but from what I hear, phone calls still matter more, even if they're voicemails. And one or two impassioned conversations probably isn't going to change anybody's mind, but if there's a massive influx of calls and emails and engagements on a particular issue from constituents, that does tend to move the needle, even for people who might otherwise be disinclined to engage in a particular side of something. There is a lot of evidence historically that can matter at the individual representative level. And then, of course, if you scale it up to the scale of all the members who can be swayed, it can really make a real difference. One comment Also, that a number of the charities and philanthropic foundations that we were talking about earlier as potential sources for funding themselves receive a fair bit of funding from the federal government. That is true in some cases. It's less true in others. But yes, I mean, there's going to be belt tightening for a variety of reasons. Also, if you might have noticed, the stock market hasn't been doing so great in the wake of everything in the recent weeks. And a lot of these philanthropic institutions are heavily invested in the market, and therefore during a downturn or a recession, which most economists appear to suggest we are very likely headed for at this point, those philanthropic institutions have to pull back because they often pay out their philanthropic monies essentially as their earnings on their stock market returns from their investments rather than from their capital or their endowment, as it were. This is also true of some private universities, by the way. So in the moment when the economy and the stock market are not doing well, that can mean that in the same moment where there's greater need than ever before, philanthropic institutions have less money to work with than they would in other circumstances. So it's another reason why it does not make sense to rely fully, as much as I hope that we can, as much as possible, scale up philanthropic contributions to all these things. It just can't replace what we've got on the taxpayer-funded side of things. Interesting question from Kit Stoltz. Have you seen or heard of any interest or comments from weathercasters, so like broadcast meteorologists on TV, for example, on the vital need for NOAA services and resources in the weather forecasting for the public? Well, I don't know if I've seen it on a public broadcast, but I believe it's John Morales out of Miami. I believe he was for at least a long time meteorologist on NBC, one of the South Florida local affiliates. He's a pretty influential guy in the region. He's been very outspoken about this. There have been some folks I know, Weather Channel meteorologists. Again, I don't know if they've done this on air, but they've certainly taken to social media and to the public and made these pleas. It's quite possible that other folks and local outlets have done the same, but sometimes these folks are pretty constrained by their employers, and right now the relationship between large media outlets, which are mainly corporate owned in the U.S., and the federal government is extraordinarily contentious, and then that's a whole nother can of worms. So I suspect that there have been pretty explicit mandates not to talk about it in some circles. So the fact that we're seeing any of those conversations at all in these spaces is actually notable, although I wish there were more. I'll let you know if the Weather Channel asks me on to have a conversation about that in the near future. They always want to talk about wildfires and atmospheric rivers and hurricanes, but we'll see. Maybe that's an open call to the folks at the Weather Channel. If they want to have me on to talk about this, I'm happy to. I'm going to keep going because there are still comments, and I think this is a really important conversation to have, and also because I know that a lot of people will be viewing this after the fact once it's not live anymore. So for posterity, I'll make the archive as complete as possible. Just give me a moment while I take another sip of water. And a reminder for late joiners that I posted at the beginning of the chat earlier today, there is a way to support the Weather West channel directly through a YouTube membership now, and you get some very modest perks, as I mentioned, like custom weather emojis that I will be creating myself, a few of which already exist. I figure it's the least I can do for tangible support, because I won't be putting any of the primary content behind any kind of paywall, because I really just think this is not the moment for that. Despite the fact that's sort of the direction that we've moved in the media landscape, I think that everybody needs full access to this fundamental information. And I noticed that quite a few folks have joined that over the course of this live stream, so thank you for that. I really do. It really does help. As a question from Gina, what are your thoughts on the Project 2025 wanting to privatize weather services? Well, I've had multiple conversations specifically on that point. You can check out my archive from my live streams. I had a couple dedicated sessions to this, including before the November 2024 election. But suffice it to say this. There is indeed a call in Project 2025 to essentially eliminate NOAA as an entity that provides public services and to fully privatize the National Weather Service. I believe that is a direct quote, actually, from Project 2025, although I don't have the document in front of me anymore. It's all Googleable, by the way, or Bingable, or Ask Jeevesable, whatever doesn't deliver you the AI slop. But anyway, that's a story for another day. But the Project 2025's articulation of privatization is, for all intents and purposes, not possible. And if you do check out my previous conversation on this, I actually have a quote that was given directly to me from the CEO of a major private weather company, and he had encouraged me to share it publicly because everybody in the private weather world is deeply concerned, because the private world exists in the weather prediction capacity atop the backbone of taxpayer-funded services. So the Weather Channel, AccuWeather, all these predictive services, none of them could exist but for NOAA giving them first 95% of the data, the raw data, and the interpreted weather model data, and satellite data, and radar data, and instrumentation data, and weather watch and warning services data for free instantly, 24/7, 365, for years. If that goes away, the private weather world simply cannot replicate it. Certainly not within a matter of years, and arguably not ever, but certainly not on the timescale of dismantling that we're seeing happening right now. If it goes away, the Weather Channel, AccuWeather, whatever your favorite weather app is, will be unable to function as they have and provide you with services like that. That is universally true across the board. Folks in the private weather world are just as frenzied right now as everybody else because no one consulted them either about this. So there's all this talk of privatizing weather. Apparently they didn't talk to the private weather world folks about the feasibility of that before the intended dismantling. Because right now we're not there. There have been several folks who have essentially intimated that we can just use AI chatbots to replace the entirety of the international weather enterprise, which is ludicrous on so many levels, I don't even know where to begin. But I did have that conversation in part in some previous sessions, so I encourage you to check it out. A comment from Mary that scientists from overseas are becoming reticent to visit here too. That's absolutely correct. That's not a rumor. There are lots of scientists who even had scheduled trips to the US who have now canceled their trips because they are concerned about their personal safety. Ironically, by the way, I am, as an employee of the University of California who is out of state much of the time, I receive travel warnings for the U.S. because I have to register even my domestic trips with the university, which makes sense for liability reasons. I get it. But as a result, I receive travel warnings from my private company for the United States now, and I've been receiving escalating travel warnings for my own trips to and from California, which is notable. Again, that's not something that I'd ever encountered before. But this is intended for an international audience primarily. So today there are reports of scientists going to a conference were either turned around to the border and effectively deported, or worse, detained at the border and remain detained. This appears to be a developing story and is related to the very concerning developments that I think are very concerning, at least on a personal level, today with the executive branch standoff with the Supreme Court. So I'm not a legal expert, I'm not an immigration expert, so I'm not going to opine further, but right now I can confirm that there is great fear among international scientists coming to the US at this point, and many of them are indeed canceling their trips, canceling their collaborations, canceling partnerships, in part because some of these partnerships and things were canceled by the funding cuts already to NOAA and other federal agencies. So there is both the fear, the personal fear of crossing the border into the US as a non-American citizen at the moment, and also just the practical reality that many of the partnerships that existed aren't there anymore scientifically because the programs were blown up or the funding was decimated. Cliff asks, do you know if DOGE is done taking the chainsaw to NOAA and the Weather Service? The answer is definitely not. If all available evidence points to large further cuts coming, implemented by whether it's DOGE or whatever mechanism that somehow completely bypasses Congress, it absolutely appears that there's more coming down the pike. Yes, since a few folks have asked, these live streams are always recorded live and are available after I push the end button. After a period of time, they become available as a recording that's available in perpetuity. This one's going to take a little bit longer to upload because it's I'm going on 2 hours instead of an office hour, so it's going to be a really large file that YouTube needs to process. So give it an hour or two, and the whole thing should be up in its full high-resolution, high-def audio glory. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, you can tell me. You can see a little more of my gray hair last time I got a haircut. You're a lot more gray than you were a couple of months ago. I suppose that's germane to this conversation, in fact. So, question from James: will climate change? Yeah, very funny. Will climate change stop now that funds for climate research have been cut? Well, I think this is a tongue-in-cheek rhetorical question, but of course the answer is no. And I actually, as I mentioned earlier, my personal and professional expectation for how much global warming, climate change will actually occur moving forward has increased from my assumption a year or two ago. It wasn't like we had completely turned the tide with the previous presidential administration either. I have no illusions there, but I do think that currently the situation is that appreciably more warming is now likely than was the most plausible trajectory just a couple of months ago. Kitty mentions, I'm ready to get off this roller coaster. That makes two of us. That's for sure. There's another question from Cliff. How much can foreign governments and universities fill in the gaps? Well, I answered most of this earlier, foreign government-wise. University-wise, again, a lot of university funding comes from the federal government, which is being decimated. So I do not think universities generally are going to be able to step up all that much because they are being absolutely decimated in terms of their top-line funding. Federal grants, by the way, the overhead for federal grants, which is now being cut across multiple agencies, originally just the NIH, but now also the DOE. Overhead is the proportion of a federal grant that is given on a competitive basis, usually to a university scientist, that covers basic operational expenses. Things like literally paying the electric and the water bill, paying for things like janitorial services, for plumbers to come fix the building's plumbing fixtures, unlike what we don't apparently have at the Weather Service anymore. Those sorts of things are paid for largely by the overhead from federal grants. What is overhead? Well, imagine that a scientist gets $1 million grant from NOAA or NASA or NSF, for example. May sound like a lot of money, but the overhead at a public university like the University of California is usually around 50 to 60%. So call it 55%, you get $1 million grant. The very first thing that happens is the university takes $550,000 of your $1 million grant to help keep the lights on, to pay for construction, janitorial services, security, policing, all of that. So immediately your $1 million grant's actually a $450,000 grant before you've done anything with it. And that's pretty typical. Overhead in some universities is even higher than that, by the way. And then you got to pay people to do the labor. And generally, by the way, and this is probably worth mentioning because it doesn't seem to be understood by some of the folks who've made these cuts, a grant from the government or any other entity to a scientist or something is not a personal windfall. Scientists don't make money off of these grants. What happens is sometimes a portion of a scientist's existing university salary is paid using the grant money. So a university, for example, generally doesn't have the money to pay a professor 100% of their stated salary. They might pay 30 or 40%, and if you're lucky, maybe 60 or 70% of your salary. But not 100%. You got to find someone else to pay the rest of your salary, and who that someone else is often scrambling year by year to find federal grants or grants from other sources to bring in external funds that the university doesn't have just to pay the salary that's stated in your job offer, for example, that you're entitled to through your employment at the university. So you pay, if you receive a successful grant and you're actively involved in administration or research on that grant, you might allocate, say, 20% of your annual salary for a few years. It's not an additional 20%, but it's just replacing the 20% that the university can't afford to pay you. Then you try and pay the people who are doing the rest of the work, your graduate students, your research associates, your postdoctoral fellows, your visiting international researchers, whoever it is who does the work, the labor of the research, you pay them. Again, not extra, but that's how salaries are paid. If you're a graduate student, usually, more often than not, your living stipend to pay for food and housing is coming from something like a federal grant. Not all the time, but much of the time. So a professor who you might be working for would have applied for that federal grant and said, I'm gonna use part of this grant, a significant portion of it, to pay for the expenses of a graduate student and their research efforts. Or a research scientist in my lab, part of their salary to do this work is going to be funded from the grant. Then you got to pay for computing infrastructure. If you work in a biology lab, you got to do everything. You got to account for everything down to the last pipette. You got to pay for that out of these grants. If you plan to go to a research conference, you guessed it, you got a budget. And by the way, having prepared some of these highly detailed budgets for federal grants, you have to get down all the way into the granularity of how much you think you're going to spend on food at a hypothetical business trip 3 years from now for 2 days to a city somewhere in the U.S. and exactly what you think your economy class airfare to said domestic city is going to be for you, your graduate students, and other people. All of that has to go into the grant up front. So it's not luxurious spending. It's not additional money. It's never a windfall for scientists. It's just how science gets done. So imagine now you get rid of these grants. You no longer have funding for that last 20 or 30% of what your salary is supposed to be. So at best, you're getting a 20 or 30% reduction in your salary because the university can't pay it all. You no longer can afford to pay for graduate students. And some universities will have a class of 2025, by the way, that doesn't exist. There are some universities in the country this year that have stopped admitting graduate students due to what's going on in the federal government for the next admission cycle. You can't pay for the postdocs. You can't pay for the laboratory supplies. You can't pay for the conference travel. You can't even pay to publish your scientific results because it costs thousands of dollars just for the page publication charges for these papers. You also can't keep the lights on potentially because all of that overhead, again, the majority of this money was going to universities in the form of overhead for basic infrastructural needs. And if you get rid of all of it, the universities are going to struggle to keep the lights on in your lab. If the toilet overflows, good luck. They might be left with a situation similar to the Weather Service where it's all DIY. If there's hazardous materials involved, of course, obviously that gets shut down completely because you can't manage that. You can't take the garbage out. You can't bring your own plunger to work. And by the way, in the federal government, lots of federal offices now, people have to bring their own toilet paper and soap because that's not being provided anymore either. Just to give a sense of what the day-to-day realities are in a world without federal science grants. All of this grinds to a halt. And in the name of efficiency, certainly doesn't sound so to me. So just trying to wrap this up before the top of the hour. So just give me a couple more minutes here to see what's left. There's a comment from Lori, and we've corresponded before. I work at a nonprofit research institute that is 100% funded by government grants. If my grants aren't funded, then I don't get paid at all. And that is the reality in some of these places where there is minimal or no base funding. And so there will be, again, cascading effects outside of the academic world too, of course. With thus accurate forecasting, the question is, how will this affect flight safety? Well, the most obvious thing that's affecting flight safety is probably that we started firing people responsible for the maintenance of our air traffic control infrastructure. But beyond that, yes, there are comments from previous FAA directors, from aviation meteorologists, and even from airlines that on this path we're going to affect flight safety by not having as much information for pilots. And this is stressful for pilots because ultimately individual pilots are responsible for all souls on board, as they say. So they have to make individual decisions. And so one thing that might happen is that responsible, risk-averse pilots may just make decisions that I am not going to fly in this, or I'm diverting, or I'm going to some other airport because it doesn't look great, but I'm not totally sure what the deal is on the ground. Maybe the terminal radar is out. We don't have, and those are really critical because you don't want to land in a downburst. You don't want to land if there's very strong wind shear. If there isn't really good weather information as to what is actually happening on the ground, best case scenario is that risk-averse pilots are going to say, nah, I'm going somewhere else. Sorry, folks. Worst case scenario is an unrecognized hazard occurs and someone flies right into it. And that used to happen in the US. It was as recently as the 1980s where there were major commercial airliner crashes because of downbursts and wind shear. And that essentially stopped happening after the 1980s because there was a huge federal government investment in weather radars and in NOAA, primarily NOAA funded, by the way, scientific research into convective hazards in aviation. We essentially eliminated aircraft crashes occurring due to that reason because we figured out what the problem was scientifically. There was a henceforth largely unrecognized set of weather, wind shear, and downburst related hazards. It was recognized that these were foreseeable, both predictable and then observable if you have the right instrumentation. So you can both know in advance that conditions might be iffy and then know in the moment for sure whether or not that condition is occurring. And not only did we stop having these kinds of crashes in the US, but we also generally stopped having them around the world because everybody else was able to use that lesson. Just as an example of how this public sector research gets used. The private sector could have done that research on its own. You could have had the airlines, funding that basic science, I suppose. But they really didn't have anywhere close to the kind of program you'd need to do that work. And ultimately, they weren't the ones that did it. They certainly benefited from it, and I don't think anybody argues that it was a good use of taxpayer dollars to prevent semi-regular commercial airliner crashes that killed a lot of people. And we maintain that infrastructure, and a lot of it's taxpayer funded, which I believe is a good thing. An example of something that was a huge success. But maybe that's just me. All right, getting close to the end here. I got like 1 minute for my self-imposed cutoff here. We'll see if I hold to it. Okay, I think I've gotten to the end here. I know I wasn't able to answer every single person's question, and the number of people on the live stream has actually started increasing again, but I am about to end it. So thanks for joining. And again, I know that not everybody wants to hear this. I know that a lot of folks do not want to hear Daniel Swain Weatherwest talk at all about politics. And I'm doing so because I think in this moment it would really be professional negligence and negligence as a citizen of this country not to have these conversations. And I am uniquely positioned to have these conversations with larger audiences, to glean insights sooner, I think, than a lot of folks have access to, because I do have so many points of contact with journalists and the government and all these other places. And I hope we can continue to have these conversations and to have such productive discussions. I do appreciate that the comments today, by and large, and really to a great degree, were interesting and constructive. Again, that's on the internet, that's rare these days, and perhaps the YouTube algorithm is doing a good job filtering out what isn't. But in any case, I think it is important to be having these conversations. So thank you for joining. Thank you especially for joining if you're here despite what I'm talking about today. If you'd rather hear me just stick to the weather, I am really glad you're here nonetheless. Please do share this video in particular. I really do want this to get out to the widest possible audience. You can share it on social media. You can share it on YouTube. And again, it might take a little while for the full version of it to upload. I think a low resolution version is available immediately. So unless you need to see my face in full HD quality, you can probably share it right away once I push the end button. But do encourage people to watch this because I think it encompasses a lot of questions that people have been asking in a wide range of contexts recently. And I do kind of intend these sessions to be archival in a sense that people can go back and look at. If you're interested, by the way, and if you're a journalist, YouTube does offer automated transcriptions of these sessions and other YouTube videos now, which actually can be really useful, particularly if I've been speaking, for example, for 2 hours and you're interested in a particular thing that I might have said. You can download that written transcript and search it for a particular term. So I've heard from some journalists that's actually a really useful feature. And so please do share it. Spread the word in general about what's going on. I think one of the most important things we can do in this moment is to make people aware of what's actually happening and what they can do to potentially shift the trajectory. But the first step there is to just make people aware of what's actually transpiring in front of us, because I think a lot of people, you might be surprised, really have no idea what's going on in this moment. So that really is the most important first step. So thanks again for joining me, and hopefully next time I'll be able to talk a little bit more about the weather and the climate in the short-term sense. But until then, I bid you farewell and talk to you next time.